Good morning.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first day of evidential hearings in Tranche 1, Phase 2 at the Undercover Policing Inquiry. My name is Neil Fernandez, and I am the hearings manager. For those of you in the virtual hearing room, please turn off both your camera and microphone unless you are invited to speak by the chairman, as Zoom will pick up on all noises and you will be on screen. I now hand over to the chairman, Sir John Mitting, to formally start proceedings. Chairman.
Thank you. At the beginning of this evidential session, as at the beginning of every evidential session, a recording made by me last year is going to be played. For those listening to it for the first time, could you please listen carefully? I am conducting this inquiry under a statute, the Inquiries Act 2005, which gives me the power to make orders regulating the conduct of the inquiry, including its hearings. In the exercise of that power, I have made a number of orders which affect what you may and may not do in the hearing rooms and after you leave them. Breach of any of the orders is a serious matter and may have serious consequences for you. If I am satisfied that a person may have breached an order, I have the power to certify the matter to the High Court, which will investigate and deal with it as if it had been a contempt of that court. If satisfied that a breach has occurred and merits the imposition of a penalty, the High Court may impose a severe sanction on the person in breach, including a fine, imprisonment for up to 2 years, and sequestration of their assets. Evidence is going to be given live over screens in the hearing rooms. It is strictly prohibited to photograph or record what is shown on the screens or to record what is said by a witness or anyone else in the hearing rooms. You may bring your mobile telephone into the hearing rooms, but you may not use it for any of those purposes. You may use it silently for any other purpose. In particular, you may transmit your account of what you have seen and heard in a hearing room to any other person, but only once at least 10 minutes have elapsed since the event which you are describing took place. This restriction has a purpose. In the course of the inquiry, I have made orders prohibiting the public disclosure of information, for example, about the identity of a person for a variety of reasons. These orders must be upheld. It is inevitable that whether by accident or design, information which I have ordered should not be publicly disclosed will sometimes be disclosed in a hearing. If and when that happens, I will immediately suspend the hearing and make an order prohibiting further disclosure of the information outside the hearing rooms. The consequence will be that no further disclosure of that information may be made by mobile telephone or other portable electronic device from within the hearing room or by any means outside it. I am sorry if you find this message alarming. It is not intended to be. Its purpose is simply to ensure that everyone knows the rules which must apply if I am to hear the evidence which I need to enable me to get to the truth about undercover policing. You, as members of the public, are entitled to hear the same public evidence as I will hear and to reach your own conclusions about it. The inquiry team will do their best to ensure that you can. If you have any doubt about the terms of this message or what you may or may not do, you should not hesitate to ask one of them, and with my help if necessary, they will provide you with the answer. Thank you. We are now going to hear the evidence of Diane Langford. Ms. Langford, I can see you on the screen. Can you hear me?
Okay, I've unmuted myself. Can you hear me?
I can now. Well done.
Very good.
First of all, you must be sworn or affirm or in some manner acknowledge that the evidence you will give will be the truth. May that now be done, please, Mr. Fernandez.
Good afternoon, Miss Langford.
Good afternoon.
Can you see and hear me?
I can.
I understand that you would like to affirm.
Correct.
Thank you. Please repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare.
And affirm that the evidence I shall give.
And affirm that the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Miss Langford. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Wilkinson.
Thank you, sir. Miss Langford, your full name is Miss Diane Langford. Are you content if I refer to you as Ms. Langford?
Yes, I am.
Amongst your many politically active roles, in 1970, you co-founded the Women's Liberation Front and state your political priority over the past 50 years to have been the liberation of women from all forms of oppression and exploitation. You are also, for the inquiry's purposes, the witness most able to assist with the political views and aims of Abhimanyu Manchanda, whom you married in January 1970 and with whom you had a child later that year. Is that correct?
Yes.
Just going to move to full screen there. Thank you. You have provided the inquiry with a thorough and detailed statement dated the 15th of March 2021, which evidence is now before the inquiry and I understand is to be published on its website today, together with 5 exhibits that you produce. Is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is.
Today we'll highlight parts of your statement and look at the context of your political activism and that of Mr. Manchanda, and consider some examples of the undercover policing reporting about you in that context. And you'll appreciate that I have to cover questions submitted by a range of core participants who've all had an opportunity to ask about different aspects of your evidence as it affects their case. If at any stage you need a break or you have any query about something I've said or you don't understand something I've said, please feel free to pause and ask.
Thank you.
You were born in New Zealand in 1941 and you witnessed the effects of colonialism and racism on the Indigenous people there. Is that right?
Yes.
Your brothers received a university education, but less importance was placed on your education.
Yes.
So by the age of 15, you were working in a factory.
Yes.
But you continued to study, and you studied in the evenings, and you studied using a correspondence course.
That's correct.
And then you moved to London, into the UK, in 1963 with your younger brother, who himself was to continue studying. And you found at that stage the shift from the strict segregation that you'd experienced in New Zealand to the life in the thriving multicultural city of London to be exciting and inspiring.
Yes.
Then it was in 1965 that Malcolm X was assassinated, and you yourself experienced 2 significant instances of personal trauma, which led you to reflect on issues of racism and sexism and spurred you into your first involvement in political activism.
That's correct.
By October 1968 then, you were a volunteer at the Campaign Against Racial Discrimination and had also joined the print union NatSopa, working as an active trade union member by then.
Yes.
And it was following the October 1968 demonstration against the Vietnam War that you joined the British Vietnam Solidarity Front, where you first met Abhimanyu Manchanda, the group's chairman.
Yes, except that it's called the Britain Vietnam Solidarity. Sorry to quibble, but I know that wrong thing got into my statement, but it's Britain.
Britain Vietnam Solidarity Front.
Yeah,
I said
yeah.
that right. Thank you.
It's a grammatical point, really.
It might be a good opportunity to have a look at the first reporting that we see from the SDS officers about you bearing your name, and in the context of that group, the Britain, and you'll see the name written there, Britain Vietnam Solidarity Front.
Mm-hmm.
Can we bring up report MPS-07326990? And Ms. Langford, that will appear on the screen in front of you when the technicians produce it. We'll make sure it's as big as it needs to be for you to see it. For your reference, sir, that's behind tab 1 of your bundle. Now, this is a report we can see dated the 11th of March 1969, so within months of the October 1968 demonstration. We can see the name of the group and the organisation written there. It's a meeting in a pub in King's Cross. And if we can scroll further down the page, we can see you're one of the individuals that's been identified as being present there. And I think, as you've noted in your statement yourself, you don't have any sort of RF or file number next to your name at that stage. It's simply a reference to mentions and then the name Diane Langford. If we can go to the top of the next part of that report, please, next page. We just, thank you, focusing at the top, we can see that one of the future activities listed is going to be the National Britain Vietnam Solidarity Front Conference that was announced for the 26th and 7th of April. And the report references the discussions of that particular event. Thereafter, you continue, we can see perhaps in the last part of that report, the last paragraph there, Al is the reference given there, Al Manchanda, summed up by congratulating all those who had taken part in the demonstration and stated that next week's meeting would be taken up by discussing the methods by which recruitment could be increased and the likely areas for setting up new branches. Just a couple of points arising out of that. The reference to Al, was that a nickname that was broadly used for Mr. Manchanda at that time? I know you call him Manu in your statement. Was Al a common name?
No, it wasn't. I've never heard it until I saw it in these reports. Sometimes if he was signing something, he used to sign it A Manchanda, but I've never seen Albert or Al ever.
You haven't?
No.
How was he commonly known amongst those that knew him well in the meetings?
Manu.
Manu. And we can see, therefore, that there's a reference to next week's meeting. Were these weekly meetings of this organisation?
I think we were meeting weekly at the Union Tavern pub for quite a long time.
Yes, and indeed some of the reporting demonstrates that you were a regular attender, broadly weekly, from about this point onwards.
That's probably right, yes.
We wind forward then to a couple of months later. We're going to look at the report in May of the same group, May 1969, and we're going to look at the report about this conference that was being identified.
Mm-hmm.
It's MPS 0736446. For your reference, sir, that's tab 6. And we can see this is about the open conference. That appears to have been a meeting that went on for over 2 days, over a weekend, I think, over both days. And it was attended by some 50 people, almost exclusively Maoists. We can see on page 5 of this report your name appears there. And by now, this is, I think, the first time we see it, you've got a file reference. So it's not just mentions now, but there's a reference to a number for you by this stage. And the reference to the people attending, about 50 Maoists. The Britain-Vietnam Solidarity Front was a Maoist group, wasn't it?
We didn't call ourselves Maoists, we called ourselves Marxist-Leninists. But I'm happy to be called a Maoist, that's shorter.
And that was because of the theory from Chairman Mao that was being discussed and espoused effectively during the course of these many meetings. Is that right?
That's right.
In fact, if we have a look, and I think we'll look at this and the underlying attached document that was written by Mr. Manchanda, but if we just look at the summary that was written by the officers attending this conference about what went on during the course of it, we can see where you agree or disagree with the summary. Can we move to page 2, please? At the latter, we can see in the second part of that first paragraph, Manchanda then read Political Report Part 1. This was heard without any show of enthusiasm and received some perfunctory applause.
Oh, sorry, I haven't caught up to that.
Oh, sorry.
This part says, it is interesting to note. Is that the paragraph?
Yeah, just above that, there's an introduction to the fact that Mr. Manchanda was reading out the political report, and we'll have a look at that a bit in a moment, just to understand what the theory was.
I see. Yeah.
This was heard without any show of enthusiasm and received some perfunctory applause at the end. A copy of his speech is given at Appendix B, and we'll have a look at that in a minute. But this is the summary.
Okay.
It is interesting to note that Manchanda features opposition to imperialism as the uniting factor between proletarian struggles in Europe and the colonial revolution in the East. This is the central theme of BVSF thinking, and its supporters were expected to believe as an article of faith that the North Vietnamese, in fighting the Americans, are not just metaphorically on the same side as revolutionary Marxists in Europe, but are actually fighting in the same war. He emphasizes that both are aspects of a world proletarian revolution, and claims that the proletariat as a class have no business to look to anyone other than Chairman Mao for guidance in their struggles. Just dropping down a little, it says, so we can see the sentence that begins, the Russians. The Russians are false exponents of the Marxist tradition and permit bourgeois elements to hold power.
Sorry, I've got left behind there a bit.
My fault.
I see, yes, I see.
Thank you to the technician for using the cursor. The Russians are false exponents of the Marxist tradition and permit bourgeois elements to hold power in their so-called socialist society. And if we drop down a little further, where we can see the quotation, can we see the word considerable just slightly higher up with the cursor if the technician can assist? Right in the middle of the sentence. Does that?
Yes, I see.
Considerable ruthlessness would be required of the proletariat before it could achieve power. Quotes, before coming to power, the proletariat and other revolutionary people should adhere to the principle of making revolution by violence, smashing the old state machine and seizing political power by armed force, end quotes. There's a reference to the Appendix B. And then this additional insert from the officer. Manchanda did not appear to hold out any immediate prospects of this uncomfortable eventuality taking place in England, but invited members of BVSF to view the world situation, especially events in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, as part of a massive anti-imperialist movement inspired by Chairman Mao. Now, that we can just take that down for a moment, please. Would you agree that that was an accurate summary of Mr. Manchanda's views and how his unifying approach to an anti-imperialistic revolution should take place?
I agree that that is a summary, but on the other hand, it is in the context of a very long document. I've also read Appendix B, where he was talking about the domination of finance capital, imperialist spheres of influence, and Mao's theory of contradiction and so on, and talking about the weakest link in imperialism, and that these struggles that were going on in Vietnam, for example, these were examples of people rising up against the state, you could say,
Yes.
and smashing the state, you could say. And I think it's in that context that it's about state power and how one perceives state power. And Mao had written a lot about that. For example, he used slogans like "political power grows out of the barrel of a gun," for example. But I think it would be obvious to anybody that this was not being put forward as something that was going to happen in this country anytime soon, although examples of struggles against state violence have occurred here. For example, people going out on the streets to protest against police violence. And one of the things that we've seen would be calling the state as being a sort of enforcer of policies such as the war in Vietnam. And when people oppose, in third world countries, as we called them back then, people were rising up, and Manu was making the connection between the working class in this country and those people who were fighting the same struggle.
And it was that's
how we saw it.
Yes, and that's
this
what
would
he was
be
emphasizing.
Solidarity. Yes, that's right. And one of the reasons why I was attracted to joining a Maoist group, as people called us, was that this gave a very clear analysis of what colonialism and imperialism was all about, and made that connection that people who are oppressed should unite and fight against that power. And I still think that.
Can I use the underlying appendix to highlight a little bit of those exact points that you're making there, Ms. Langford?
Yes.
So this isn't in the same tabbed up bundle, so you may have to refer to it on screen. It's reference MPS 0736447. And this is the appended report that the officer provided back to Special Branch, which is the actual speech written by Mr. Manchanda and delivered over the course of that weekend. You can see there his name, as you say, he signed things A. Manchanda.
Yes.
General Secretary of the BVSF. And we can see this was for the open conference. If we could perhaps go to page 3. And there are several paragraphs that begin formally. Formally, it was the accepted thing. Can we just scroll down to the lower part of the page to look at one of those examples? Yes, so about halfway down the page, can we see that the sentence begins, formally it was accepted, a paragraph starts, formally it was the accepted thing to speak of the proletarian revolution.
Yeah.
Thank you, that's the right example. To speak of the proletarian revolution in one or another developed country as of a separate and self-sufficient entity, opposing a separate national front of capital as its antipode. Now, this point of view is no longer adequate. Now we must speak of the world proletarian revolution for the separate national fronts of capital. We have become linked in a single chain because the world front of imperialism, which must be opposed by a common front of the revolutionary movement in all countries. Is that an example of the point being made, that there is a single link between all the fights against the state, whether it be in Vietnam or on the ground in England?
Yes, I think that puts it very well. And also I'd like to invite you to look at it from the other side of it, which is that the violence, which is obviously people have implied that we were more violent, or we had our agenda was somehow violent. It was completely the other way around, and that these kind of documents that you're looking at now are about people resisting the violence of the state in order to get justice, freedom, liberation, call it what you will. The vast majority of people have to, at some point, come up against the state, as we've seen in so many different things that are going on at the moment. For example, the issue of deaths in custody and so forth.
Yes.
And the resistance to justice in terms of so many issues, including the demands of the women's liberation movement, which have still been unmet.
Yes. If I may, with you, Miss Langford, look at a few more quotes from this lengthy document, because it does highlight exactly all those points, and indeed draws right towards the end of it. I'll show how it draws the various different strands of groups of resistance, or strands of people that were being affected on the ground in the UK, and we can see then the impact and what Mr. Manchanda was talking about in terms of what should be happening in the UK. If we look at page 7, please. We can see at the top, this is the part where he's talking about the era of world proletarian revolution under the banner of the Mao, forgive me, I can't pronounce that particularly well, Sesong thought. And we can see there's a part scrolling a little further down, which begins, Lenin said, quoting from, thank you. Yes, thank you. Lenin said that the basic question in any revolution, and this is, I think, the point you were making there, Ms. Langford, in any revolution is that of state power. He also said that those who recognize only class struggle are not yet Marxists. Only he is a Marxist who extends the recognition of the class struggle to the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. So it should be that the proletariat should end up with the power to be able to be the dictatorship. And that's what was marking Lenin out in his particular views. And you would identify your group as a Marxist-Leninist group. Is that right?
That's right.
It goes on, the dictatorship of the proletariat is the quintessence of Marxism-Leninism, the issue of the proletarian revolution and the magic weapon, which guarantees that the proletariat will defeat the bourgeoisie and be victorious in its socialist cause. I think if we just scroll a little further, that's where the reference to the quote that was taken out of this report and put into the police report then comes. We just scroll a little further down that page. Oh no, forgive me. It's about the paragraph that begins, the penultimate paragraph that begins, the new historical experience. If we can just focus on that, please. Thank you. The paragraph that begins, new historical experience. Are you following there? Thank you very much. Thank you. And if we drop down about 4 lines, we can see where the quote comes from. Before coming to power. Thank you. Before coming to power, the proletariat and other revolutionary people should adhere to the principle of making revolution by violence. And this is what the officer was quoting. Yes. Smashing the old state machine and seizing political power by armed force. Once in power, the proletariat should carry the socialist revolution through to the end, prevent the revisionists from usurping the leadership of the state, the party and the state, prevent the restoration of capitalism, and defend and consolidate the dictatorship of the proletariat. So it was in that context that was the reference to the violence and the smashing of the state. Obviously, revolution appears to have been the aim. Would you agree with that?
I do agree up to a point, but obviously this was completely theoretical. And it was also seen in a global context. So, for example, the victory of the Vietnamese people over the US forces in Vietnam was seen as a huge victory for people all over the world. Perhaps we might have thought rather that this country would have been the last place where such a revolution might take place, although there was one further back in history. But I think Lenin actually told Clara Zetkin that if you want to do something very difficult, go and do your work in England. So there was a recognition that this was a very much a theoretical postulations that he's putting forward here, and he's using a lot of quotations from books by Lenin, by Mao, by Stalin, and others who'd written tracts on the issue of the state. And the issue of the state was very, very much studied within our group, and study sessions were held regularly to read theoretical works, not only of Mao, Lenin, and so forth, but others as well who've written about the issue of the state.
And did you agree and share that same political thinking and theory with him?
Yes, I still think that the state is a force which is there to act as the enforcer of oppression. Yes.
How did he and you want to achieve the revolution that was the theory without violence?
Well, there are many different methods that we used. For example, having demonstrations, public meetings, showing films. We also would do even parliamentary lobbying. There are lots of different ways of organizing, of taking part in trade union activity, industrial activity, literature, film, social media, strikes, rent strikes, boycotts, occupations, motorcades. I've been involved in all of those things, street theatre, hustings, influencing political parties, housing associations, tenants associations, solidarity groups, women's groups, prisoners' rights groups, tenants associations, and all of these, of course, civil society organizations. And all of these are the kind of organizations that have been targeted by the SDS, or who acted, in my view, like the Stasi.
Was it made clear during the course of all of these events or efforts and demonstrations and public meetings that violence was not to be used?
Yes, as a matter of fact, yes, as a matter of fact, it was very, very strongly, very, very strongly upheld by our group in particular, as a Maoist group, that self-discipline in organizing and demonstrating and so forth was very important, and any kind of individual activity was really frowned on. For example, the notion of, say, the Angry Brigade people, we would have frowned on their activity, and anybody who indulged in macho posturing at demonstrations. I remember somebody who was a member of our group once did take off his shirt outside the South African embassy and set fire to it. And he was very much condemned and caused a lot of anguish in our group that he behaved, and we thought that was petty bourgeois and adventurist. These were the sort of words that we used about people who indulged in in that sort of posturing.
How widely held in your groups was this understanding and appreciation of that violence wasn't to be used? You've talked of an example there where somebody did decide to take that fairly dramatic.
Yes.
Why would he have?
It was very much part of the ethos of the group that there should be collective activity and not people going off and, you know, acting like idiots on their own.
May I just finish off with this document to demonstrate how the appeal of this group and Mr. Manchander's thinking linked in with your particular field of interest in terms of women's liberation and had a broader impact. By part 2 of this report, Mr. Manchander is dealing with what is happening in the UK, and we see him link in the struggles of many different groups to the suffering under the wider British imperialism. At page 18 of the report, if we can go to that. We see this is the rapid decline of British imperialism and the struggle of the working class for political power. And from the police reporting, this appears to have been the paper he delivered on the second day of the conference. If we scroll down to the latter part of this page, please. We can pick it up about halfway down where it says, and he's here linking in different groups, in order to crush the workers' resistance, new fascist repressive measures are being rushed through. And he was pointing to Barbara Castle's white paper, which threatened militant workers' resistance with fines and jails. I think that was a paper aimed at trying to take away power from trade unions that was being introduced at that stage. Drop down to the next paragraph, he references Ireland. He says, Britain's oldest colony, Ireland, still remains half under the direct oppression and exploitation and the other half under indirect rule. What an irony of British democracy. The people of Northern Ireland, in their struggle even for ordinary civil liberties and voting rights, are brutally suppressed by the Royal Ulster Constabulary, using water cannon, armoured cars and truncheons. Facing the rising militant resistance of the Northern Ireland people, the rulers from Westminster, in utter panic, are rushing in more troops. So he's appealing there to workers who feel that their trade union causes are being limited. He's appealing there to people in Ireland who are struggling. Halfway up the paragraph, just above the reference to Ireland, forgive me, there's a reference to Enoch Powell. Can we see that? While Enoch Powell incites racialism in words, Wilson, supported by Heath, enforces racial discrimination and oppression against the coloured minorities to divide the working class and divert their wrath from the exploiting bosses, monopoly capitalists. So he's appealing to those people who are suffering racism. If we just scroll down to the next part, next page, please. This is a repetition. I think it's been copied in an odd way. This is repetitious of the page we've just seen before. So if we can move to probably page 20. At the top of that page, there's a new awakening amongst the students and youth in their growing struggle against bourgeois cultural values, the system of education and desire to unite with the working class against the onslaught of capitalist system. And I think there had been a reference at the top of the last page to them being the victims of police brutality and appealing to people in that sphere. And then finally, the paragraph beginning, working women who've suffered double servitude since class oppression emerged in society are also being drawn into the working class struggle in the economic, social and political fields for equal rights and their own emancipation. So this is his theory and his rhetoric and his speech, appealing to a broad base of people all struggling under oppression, he would say, and therefore all motivated to rise up and act in resistance to the state. And this is where the interests of those people who feel they're suffering in Ireland, as well as women, as well as workers, all come together under the same umbrella in this thinking. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, it is.
And so the BVSF, on the face of it, he hoped would attract a lot of membership from all of these groups that all felt that they were needing to raise awareness and take action.
I guess so.
He latterly, I think right at the bottom of this page, I think, can we go to the very end paragraph where he references other groups of a similar title as being fraudulent, and he was cautious to guard against people being distracted by a slightly different vein of this political thinking. Is that fair? Let's move. So page 21.
I don't see that on the screen, but I can speak about it anyway.
Let me just see if I can assist with a reference
Okay, thanks.
on the page. Yes, that very bottom paragraph, please. Beginning, it is impossible. About halfway on that line, it is impossible to oppose and overthrow imperialism without simultaneously carrying on a ruthless fight against revisionists, social democrats, and Trotskyites, and their fraudulent diversionary tactics in the so-called unity of the left. Only this correct political orientation can real unity of the revolutionary forces be established and a mass movement built. The BVSF must take the initiative to unite in action with the new militant forces of youth and workers. So is he guarding against different strains of theory? And
let me just go through that. Was it Social Democrats, Trotskyites, and what was the other one?
Revisionists.
Oh yeah, I'll just explain what that was about. It's such a long time ago, but these were quite live things at the time. Social democracy, I guess he's talking about sort of parliamentary democracy, where thinking that things can change through the parliamentary system, which was not seen to be a possibility, although it could be part of that. But the actual philosophy of social democracy didn't take into account the issue of the state. Trotskyite thing would be about the differences over, for example, the issue of Vietnam. This explains it quite neatly, that the Trotskyite groups didn't regard the Vietnam resistance as being revolutionary, because it was being waged basically by peasantry, as they would see it. So therefore, anyone who owned, say, a plot of land couldn't possibly be revolutionary, because they had owned some private property, even though they might just be subsistence farmers. But Mao's theory was that people who, in countries which were underdeveloped and didn't have an industrial working class to carry through this so-called revolution, which would be based on an industrial working class overthrowing the government in somewhere like this country. So that was a difference. So there were differences about, for example, Trotskyite groups would not adopt the slogan "Victory to the NLF," because the NLF was, they saw those as just being national movements and therefore not revolutionary. And the revisionist thing is about the role of the Soviet Union. And as mentioned in this document as well, the Soviet Union had invaded Czechoslovakia and went on to invade Afghanistan as well. So it was seen as another neo-colonial, neo-imperialist, social imperialist. That's how that would have been seen. So those were the three themes and the differences between the different groups.
And particularly the view of how much you ally yourself with that approach to Russia and the Soviets. Was it that sort of level of division and disagreement in that purist thinking that led ultimately to disagreements within the leadership of the BVSF?
Yes.
And ultimately the fragmentation of the group.
That's right.
Yeah.
And also, Manu was not convinced that sections of the white working class were ready to give up the privileges that they derive from colonialism. Whereas others were saying the British working class is the most advanced in the world and all of that sort of stuff.
And was it this feature of feminism being part of a unified worldwide approach to oppression that caught your imagination?
Yes, definitely, it was.
Thank you. And so we know that this was a meeting in 1969, halfway through 69. In 1970, you founded the Women's Liberation Front, and also the Women's Equal Rights Campaign.
Yes.
The Women's Liberation Front were demanding equality for women in all spheres, campaigning regularly, particularly in respect of education for girls and women. Whereas the Equal Rights Campaign focused more on trades union and working with trades unions.
That's right.
And you, I think, arranged and attended the first Women's Liberation Conference in 1970.
Yes. Well, I was part of a larger organising group that set up Ruskin, yes.
That division in thinking and theory, we see a little more of at where somebody called Nick Bateson appears to have been voted out of the meeting and expelled because of the division in the purism and the thinking. If we can just have a look at a document to remind ourselves about that. It's MPS 0736435. Tab 9 for your bundle, sir. Here's the London region meeting of the BVSF, and we can see that the agenda for the meeting was the role of the Batesons and Ibrahim in the BVSE to the expulsion of the above mentioned, and then the election of new officers and an executive committee, together with forthcoming plans for the BVSF. The meeting was chaired by Harpal Brar, who explained briefly the reasons for the meeting and then asked Al Manchanda to give an account of the Bateson and Ibrahim's revisionist activities over the past 2 years. And this Mr. Manchanda did at great length. There was a short discussion, and indeed he was arguing, and I think this is exactly the point you were making, that the revisionist principles didn't sit with the Marxist-Leninist principles. Is that right?
Yes.
And indeed, so this vote took place, and we can see, if we scroll down towards right at the bottom of the page, well, perhaps just further down this part of the page, thank you. We can see that various people were being proposed to be elected into positions in the group. You're present at the meeting. Mr. Manchanda's being elected as chairman. And the proposal to eject these people and vote a new committee in was accepted unanimously. And if we look over the page, that appears to have been reported on by Detective Sergeant M. Ferguson. So amongst that group, involved in a vote which expelled people and formed a new executive committee, there appears to have been an SDS officer.
Yes, apparently.
You continued to attend meetings, and indeed meetings of groups titled slightly differently. There was the VSC group as well. Did you attend meetings of that committee? The Vietnam Solidarity Committee?
Yes, I did. To be honest with you, I don't remember being there, but I can see from the files that I did attend such a meeting.
Yes, and those carried on, and simultaneously you were developing the Women's Liberation Front and starting that. So perhaps if we can move to an early example of a report about the Women's Liberation Front. It's at tab 17, sir, for you, and then for the screen, it's UCPI 5026987. So this is the latter part of 1970. If we just look at the bottom part of the page, it's signed by HN45, and that is an officer that you recall, and recall his cover name as Dave Robertson. Is that right?
Yeah.
And this is a meeting where that paragraph we can see beginning with your name, Diane Langford, and there appears to be a hand entry, i.e. Mrs. Manchanda. Were you married by then, by November 1970?
Yes.
And you're there referenced as the General Secretary of the Women's Liberation Front.
Yes.
Put forward a resolution condemning the renewed bombing of North Vietnam by US imperialist forces, and a copy of this would be sent to the Vietnamese Women's Union. The meeting was then closed by Chris McKinnon, and there was no mention made of any future activities at that point, and we see a number of people mentioned as having attended there. What were the aims? How did the Women's Liberation Front single itself out within the women's liberation movement? What was different about the front as opposed to anything else? And this report can come down.
Sure. Well, we called it the Women's Liberation Front to identify it with liberation as a liberation organization in solidarity with other liberation organizations around the world. And there were differences in terms of putting the emphasis on working class women. Some of the aims of our organization were a little bit different from the four main aims of the women's liberation movement, although we were the group who put forward the aim of equal education. We brought that to the table, and that was accepted by the whole women's liberation movement. Other differences that I could mention were that we had included other aims in our manifesto, so to speak, such as that the term illegitimate shouldn't be used about children, and that notion of being born out of wedlock was very stigmatizing, and that whole thing affected working class women very deeply. And we'd also added a couple of other aims into our manifesto, such as changing the divorce laws and about male violence.
If I brought up the manifesto, would that help summarize it for you?
Yeah.
Reference UCPI 5010570, and we'll look at page 3 of that, please. And there are the 7 points I think, of your aims and objectives. If you would just
Okay.
have a look at that, please. Do you recognise that this is a document that you had a hand in
Yeah.
writing?
Yeah.
Is that your address?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Powerful image, title Women's Liberation Front, and this was the leaflet that you would regularly hand out at various of your meetings and your conferences.
Yes.
Point 1 was organising women in general, working class women in particular, and win support from the other sections of the community to fight for a society in which there shall be no exploitation and oppression of women, and where they shall enjoy equal rights and opportunities with men. Point 2, to fight for the equal rate for the job. So equal pay was important, although there was legislation, I think, going through Parliament in 1970 for the Equal Pay Act, wasn't there?
There was, but it was hedged about with all kinds of ways that employers could get out of it.
Point 3, to fight for equal opportunities in employment, education, training, social and political life, and then a reference particularly there to prenatal and postnatal periods that return to the right to return to the same job without suffering any loss as of a right guaranteed by statutory law, something you were campaigning for particularly. 4, to fight against discrimination against women with regard to marriage, and as you just referenced, divorce, inheritance of property, taxation, insurance, in all fields of economic and social life in the community. Point 5, all women should have the right to bear children or not. If we scroll down. In order to make this right effective, adequate contraceptive and abortion facilities should be made available free on the National Health Service. 6, to involve women in political and social activities, thus to help in the development of their long suppressed talents and to wage a consistent struggle against male chauvinism. And point 5, to support the struggles of women of all countries in the realisation of the common aims to end the system of exploitation and oppression. And for this purpose, to take part in the struggle in Britain and support the struggle of the workers and oppressed people all over the world. And that's what you had to sign up to if you wanted to become a member of your group.
Yeah.
We can see the link between the Women's Liberation Front and the Marxist-Leninist theory and thinking by virtue of the fact that there was a group called the Revolutionary Marxist-Leninist League that I think was Mr. Manchanda was very influential in, as were you, where there was quite an overlap of membership. Is that right?
That's right.
If you can briefly help us with, what did the Revolutionary Marxist-Leninist League do differently from the Britain-Vietnam Solidarity Front, for example? We can take this report down now.
Okay, well, the RMLL was a very small group of maybe 10 to 12 people who saw themselves as being people who had more experience. For example, Manu had experience of the anti-colonial struggle in India. He'd previously been the partner of Claudia Jones, who set up the first Black newspaper in Britain and was instrumental in starting the first Caribbean Carnival in this country. She'd been expelled from the United States under the McCarthyite period. So we're talking about influences which were very long-standing within liberation theory and practice. So those of us who wanted to go into things more deeply, to read, to study revolutionary theory, to understand the history of different revolutions as they happened in the Soviet Union, in China, in Cuba, etc., to understand the national liberation struggles that were going on in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. We formed this small group and then tried to reach out by forming other groups which didn't require the same amount of commitment. For example, on the issue of Vietnam and on women's liberation. And there was a group called Friends of China as well, which was about supporting China's right to be a member of the United Nations, which it wasn't back then. So this was the difference. And
So was this something of a thinking hub, the RMLL, the sort of almost
yes, I'd say so.
steering the
Yes,
activities of other groups?
that's right.
And it was a very small group. So if an
Very
estate
tiny
officer was
group.
reporting on this group, it would be within a very small membership of
Very, very small.
of effectively a steering committee.
Yes.
I'm conscious of the time, it's 1 o'clock. We'll come back and have a look at a report from an officer who was in exactly one of these meetings as soon as we resume again at 2 o'clock, I think we start doing. If that's convenient with you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you. Ms. Langford, will you be ready and able to resume at 2?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you.
Splendid. Thank you. I'm afraid you've got another hour and a half or so to go, but
That's fine. I'm sure I'll be fine. Thank you.
good. Until 2, let's be.
We will now take a break for lunch. Hearings will resume at 2 p.m.